morning.
Good morning.
I really could have done without the 2 decades of experience. Thanks anyway. Every weekday at about 6 a.m., the Federal Register arrives in my inbox, and it comes compliments of the National Archives and the Government Printing Office. The Register is a compendium of administrative actions, presidential documents, and new regulations issued by executive branch agencies. I examine each day's table of contents for the Federal Register because I need to keep abreast of current regulatory trends and to uncover particularly egregious rules that I highlight in a series I do called Tales of the Red Tape. These have included, for example, a Department of Justice requirement that hotels, restaurants, and airlines accommodate miniature horses as guide animals for the disabled, precise temperature, moisture, and chemical standards for manure set by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and the USDA's edict on affirmative action for vegetables. That's no more than 1 cup per week of lima beans, peas, corn, or potatoes permitted each student because Washington wants our children to, quote, try new vegetables. So I have a surefire method for spotting one of my tales, and it usually is one in which it will elicit from me the following. Seriously? And that's precisely how I regard Michigan's quota on competition in the generation of electricity. Seriously, are we still talking about this? We are a country for which competition has delivered spectacular advances in every aspect of our lives. We're the envy of the world, in fact. And the competition of ideas is fundamental to our liberty. Now, of course, there are those who don't exactly cotton to competition. It requires effort, it requires innovation, it requires efficiency, but we should not be captive to their lethargy. All of which is to say, we shouldn't have to be here. Energy is far too important to the Michigan economy to be governed by political forces rather than market forces. Households and businesses collectively spend nearly $9.5 billion annually on electricity, but 90% of that revenue is collected by consumers and Edison. This government-sanctioned market dominance of electricity generation is all the more maddening considering that both companies were lavishly compensated for a very short-lived open market in generation. Evidence abounds that the Michigan power market is unduly constrained. The number of customer accounts on a waiting list to receive electricity from an alternative supplier has topped 10,000. In the absence of the current 10% cap, competition, participation, and choice would immediately exceed 20% in the service territories of both utilities. In comparison to the 10 largest states, Michigan has the 4th highest average retail electricity rates for residential customers, the 3rd highest for commercial customers, and the 5th highest for industrial customers. That is not a recipe for economic recovery. Finally, there are 23 alternative electricity suppliers that are licensed in the state, but only 11 are actively serving customers. We know competition would make a significant difference. We know because it is flourishing in other states. We know because of the successful deregulation of other industries. We know because even limited competition in energy supply delivered benefits to Michigan in the past. Competition produced cost savings for both commercial and industrial firms and attracted investment in new electric generating capacity to the state. That was before Jennifer Granholm and the incumbents joined forces to take it away. Now, speaking of the former governor, who promised to make Michigan the epicenter of green energy, allow me just a couple words on the so-called 25 and 25 idea. Advocates claim that a renewable portfolio standard of 25% by 2025 would create jobs and result in only minimal rate increases. But isn't that what we were told with regard to the 10% quota? That's not the experience here or in other states where the dictate has been enacted, or among the various European countries that aggressively pursued higher mandates like 25%. As my colleague Jack Spencer has documented, recent headlines overseas have referred to these mandates as, quote, destroying the economy and real horror stories. There's certainly nothing wrong with individual entrepreneurs or interest groups pursuing development of renewable energies and finding ways to make them economically viable. More power to them. But it is not the proper role of government to force Michigan citizens to subsidize energy companies who otherwise can't compete on price or reliability. Such a tax will hinder, not enhance, economic growth and the well-being of Michigan citizens. Rudyard Kipling once cautioned us, never look backwards or you'll fall down the stairs. But in this instance, it is instructive to review the benefits that accrued from even the narrow deregulation in electricity supply enacted by the Michigan legislature in 2000, with passage of Public Acts 141 and 142. In the late 1990s, Michigan was burdened with historically high electricity rates and dismal customer service. This prompted lawmakers to restructure the industry. The new law unbundled the three elements of electricity service: generation, transmission, and distribution. It also established a schedule by which competitive suppliers could market electricity to residential, commercial, and industrial customers. Public Act 141 also cut by 5% the residential rates charged by the incumbent utilities and froze them at that level for 5 years. Thus, customers had less incentive to seek service alternatives. Two other elements of Public Act 141 undermine prospects for a truly competitive market. First, the incumbent utilities were required to maintain at all times enough generating capacity to serve the peak demand of all customers in their regions. This required the utility to maintain infrastructure for which it had no demand. Second, the incumbents were required to restore service at a regulated rate to any customer who left a competing supplier. Although modest, the reforms yielded some progress. Between 2000 and 2004, non-incumbent suppliers captured well over 20% of Michigan's industrial and commercial retail customers. That's by volume, in the combined Edison and consumer service areas. In the same period, industrial and commercial electricity rates fell by approximately 3% and 4% respectively in Michigan. But they were rising about 13% and 10% nationwide. The state's average rates for all customers display a similar trend. In fact, Michigan's total electricity prices across all sectors dropped by about 2%, while the nation's total electricity prices rose by about 12%. You don't need to memorize the numbers. The takeaway here is that competition, even limited competition, benefited families and businesses in Michigan. Also telling, Michigan's electricity prices, which were typically higher than those of Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and Wisconsin, fell enough to diminish the gap and make the state more competitive with its neighbors. There was less change in the state's residential sector, but that was not unexpected. The incumbent utilities' residential rates during this period were regulated at an artificially low level. This constrained the potential for profit and rendered the residential sector less attractive to new suppliers. Unfortunately, the benefits of competition were reversed after 2004, when state government bestowed a generous subsidy upon Edison and Consumers Energy in the form of a $2.2 billion state loan guarantee, which was backed by a surcharge, a tax, on their own and their competitors' customers. But the utilities for decades had been guaranteed profits from their captive customer base, irrespective of efficiency or economic discipline. Under rate of return regulation, the utilities' income actually rose with every dollar the utilities spent. The state loan guarantees provided the incumbent utilities with a marked competitive advantage over prospective competitors in both better access to capital and lower debt costs. The surcharge also imposed on competitors' customers the surcharge that was imposed on competitors' customers narrowed the price differences between new, more efficient electricity suppliers and the incumbents. Simply put, customers of competing suppliers were subsidizing the former monopoly. Stranded cost recovery also undermined the rate discipline that partial deregulation had stimulated. The average price of electricity for industrial customers in Michigan jumped 23% between 2004 and 2006, while industrial rates rose 17.3% for the nation as a whole. So that's a differential of about 6 percentage points. The state's commercial rates fared just a bit better, rising 12.4% compared to 15.8% nationwide. Thus, after 2004, the state's electricity rates were no longer rising less than the national average. The infusion of cash intended to indemnify the incumbents against possible losses from competition and to compensate the companies for the cost of regulatory mandates undercut the price advantage of alternative suppliers. The non-incumbents' market share, which had been skyrocketing, plummeted, and Michigan's electricity prices were on the rise again. The premise of stranded costs was belied by the incumbent utilities' ownership of valuable power plants, for which there continued to be market demand. To the extent competition might have diminished their market share, they could still sell surplus energy on the spot market, allowing them to export electricity elsewhere or by private contract, as long as the energy was produced at competitive prices. Moreover, utility investors had enjoyed the considerable fruits of monopoly status for decades. Covering stranded costs prolonged that advantage. There was no such bailout of incumbents in the deregulation of any other industry that I'm aware of. Consumers' residential customers have reportedly suffered a 47% increase in their electricity rates over the past 4 years. Large commercial customers have been hit with 40% rate increases, and small commercial customers experienced 30% rate hikes. Edison has also issued double-digit rate hikes on their customers, all with regulators' blessing. While consumers and Detroit Edison's rates have soared, wholesale generation rates in the competitive wholesale electric markets in which the utilities operate have decreased by an average of 45%. Despite a growing body of evidence, too many Michigan legislators and regulators persist in treating electricity generation as a so-called natural monopoly. Doing so perpetuates their influence and power. But 20 years of experience elsewhere undermines that antiquated notion. The post-war technological trend in the United States toward building larger generating plants ended in the mid-1960s. Most important, regions could support enough generating plants to permit extensive competition if the plants were under separate ownership and had equal access to transmission and distribution, which they do now, or would if they were allowed to compete. Only sunk costs and regulatory insulation give an existing firm the cost advantage necessary to thwart competition. But without those significant sunk costs, that is, the ability to build smaller, more efficient, more innovative plants, competition can undermine monopoly prices. Natural monopoly thus becomes unsustainable. Competitive generation drives efficiency and innovation. Producers must scrutinize their cost structure at every margin. This produces savings, as opposed to monopolistic and bureaucratic self-interest. What we have in Michigan today, with monopoly-sanctioned utilities guaranteed cost recovery, is scant incentive to innovate or maximize efficiency. This subjects the utilities' customers to the financial risk of undisciplined decisions and performance. Lower electricity costs are not the only benefit of a competitive marketplace. Competition creates new and better services, a dynamic that's wholly absent under the current regulatory regime. Competition also improves reliability. Supply is more secure when spread among a larger number of sources. But even absent a price differential, competition is still preferable to government-sanctioned monopoly. We are a country of free enterprise, supposedly, and competition is the essence of free enterprise. The incumbents' resistance to competition is understandable, particularly in light of looming costs from the Obama administration's war on coal. They face potentially crippling emissions control costs unless Congress reins in the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. But foisting ever higher regulatory costs on Michigan's families and businesses is not the solution to their problem. If nothing else, shifting the costs to consumers will weaken our resolve and corporate resolve and political resolve for change. The way forward is very clear. We must stop providing incumbent utilities with large subsidies that have undermined competition. We must eliminate capacity mandates that unnecessarily burden them and reduce their competitiveness. And we must terminate regulatory cross-subsidies that favor residential customers, discourage residential energy conservation, and reduce competition in the residential marketplace. Competition elsewhere has lowered prices, improved customer service, and improved resource efficiency. There's every reason to believe that the impact will be similar here once the constraints on competition are lifted. With employment exceeding 9%, with per capita income lagging the national average, with public schools in disturbing decline, with infrastructure eroding everywhere, and with all the other challenges facing this state, we shouldn't have to be devoting time and attention to breaking a legislated stranglehold on competition in electricity generation. This needs to get done, seriously. Thank you.